Good afternoon. I am in my third year here at Liberty University's PhD history course, and I've enjoyed many of Dr. Schultz's videos, especially the on-location ones. So this video was inspired by Dr. Schultz. To paraphrase Dr. Schultz, I am standing here before you today in front of this Patriot cannon from the American Revolutionary War. This cannon was used in the Battle of White Plains. White Plains is north of New York City. The battle itself took place on October 28, 1776, and I spent much of my childhood here. In fact, this cannon may be the inspiration for my love of history. The backstory to the battle goes as such. After the siege of Boston, George Washington moved his troops to New York in anticipation of a British invasion, and he got it. The largest armada of ships up until that time landed in New York. The only armada larger than that would be the D-Day landings of 1944. Washington, realizing his troops were outnumbered, moves them from Brooklyn to Manhattan. The British land at 23rd Street, which was then called Kips Bay, and they chase Washington north up an old Indian trail, which is now referred to as Broadway. Along the retreat, Washington faithfully leaves 2,000 of his men guarding Fort Washington at the north end of the island. Those 2,000 men were captured, and a year later, when they were exchanged in a prisoner of war exchange, only 800 were still alive, which speaks to the horrible conditions of the British prisoner of war ships in New York Harbor. The 24.2-mile path from Kips Bay up to White Plains is a beautiful tree-lined set of streets that I've actually jogged as a marathoner. And in the fall, which Washington would have experienced, they turn lovely colors of fall, different shades of brown. Washington and his 3,000 men arrive in White Plains in October of 1776. Washington had two advantages. First of all, General Howe was cautious. Had Howe attacked Washington the way Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters attacked Burgoyne in Saratoga, the American Revolution would have been over. But Howe was not going to send his men ahead of their supply wagons, so Washington and his men had a full week before the British ever arrived in White Plains. The second advantage was home turf. Washington may be a Virginian, but he and his men were fighting for their country, their land. And while New York may have been a loyalist stronghold, White Plains was friendly toward the Revolution and gave aid and maps and support to Washington and his men. The Battle of White Plains commences a week after Washington arrives. Howe sent British General Henry Clinton and Hessian Colonel Johann Rall up Chatterton's Hill. We are at the bottom of Chatterton's right now. This cannon would originally been at the top, about a half a mile up. It's a steep embankment. Try to picture what it's like going up this steep embankment. We often talk about Civil War soldiers walking up hills or walking into bullets, or even D-Day going up the Atlantic Wall. Here, several units of Continentals rain down musket shot and cannonball on British and Hessians. Washington, at that time, here in White Plains, had under him the 2nd Connecticut, the 1st Delaware, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New York, and the 1st Maryland. From the top of the hill, the Americans were looking down and firing down at multiple waves of British and Hessians trying to scale this embankment. On the third try, the Hessians are able to get to the top and break the lines of the Continentals. At the end of the battle, 233 British were dead, 217 Americans were dead. While it is a loss, there is something of value here. As Washington is ordering a retreat, he leaves 30 men at the top of the hill to hold off the entire British Hessian force, and they succeed. Just as George Meade could not have pursued Robert E. Lee at the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, because if he had, he would have finished off Lee, so too here, the British Hessian contingent fails to pursue Washington, thankfully, or they would have finished off the Revolution. The fact is, 17th century armies would march to battle, fire upon each other, and let the other retreat. Once Washington retreats, he's able to get across to New Jersey, across the river, and then to Valley Forge. Later this year, that same year, on December 26, George Washington will surprise Hessian forces at the Battle of Trenton, which were commanded by none other than Hessian commander Johann Rau. Rau will be killed at this battle, an ironic twist of fate that Washington will finally beat Rau.